Now given that it's all difficult, just to describe something in society, just to get some measures of anything is extremely difficult, costly, time consuming. We really ought to find out what's already known. We need to know whether it's worth doing this research. I think just about everybody listening to this lecture will be familiar with the idea of a literature review. You can go and see what's been published on a particular research topic. But undertaking a literature review can be a complicated and time-consuming business in itself. There are different forms of review. A narrative review would try to tell the story of how research has developed in a broad area over perhaps a number of years, different traditions, try to make sense of it all. And it would give a good flavour for what's gone on in a particular area. But increasingly, people are suggesting that actually we should approach our reviewing systematically. This doesn't mean that people who've done narrative reviews were utterly unsystematic. You know, they just kind of went into the library, put anything off the shelf and kind of had a quick look. And they were totally unsystematic, but systematic reviews are systematic in a very, very specific sense. They have a specific search strategy to address a particular research question. That search strategy needs to be set out in detail. So, for example, you would say which library databases you'd searched, on which day even. Yeah? You'd identify the terms that you put into that search, the number of hits that you got back, why you chose to read the ones you chose, how you extracted the data from those that you chose to pursue. And in fact, you'd almost certainly involve another researcher. It wouldn't be a lone effort sitting in a library. There may be a team of a dozen people working across the world, carving up this literature into manageable parcels, extracting the data from it and evaluating it, and then comparing notes with one another, cross-referring certain samples to check they come up with the same conclusions. Systematic reviews are there to try and make sure that we don't repeat research that doesn't need doing, and that we know which research does need doing. Obviously, that then begs the question of how we would combine this research, and synthesis is probably one of the most important things going on. If there's been all this investment of time and money in research, we really ought to be in a position to combine it so that we get the full picture. There are no research studies that have given the definitive answer on any interesting question. It takes multiple studies coming at from different perspectives, repeating things to check against error, to really let us know that we know an answer or have a good idea of what the answer is on a particular question. Often that's done statistically with what's called meta-analysis, where you can take the statistics reported in a range of studies, combine the data and do other forms of analysis that let you work out what the effects are over much larger populations and different circumstances. Okay. Well, let's assume we were doing something there around happiness. Finding happiness, well, there's a question of finding happiness in our own lives, but leave that to one side. The question of finding research on happiness, as you can see, it's actually not going to be very easy, because happiness isn't a term that's very easy to define. It's not one that everybody would approach in the same way. So if you're trying to find literature on happiness, what search terms are you going to put in? Well, you might use happiness itself, but just sitting there, you would be able to come up with lots of other terms. You might come up with broad kind of synonyms like contentment, maybe satisfaction, life satisfaction. Maybe you're familiar with some of the literature, so you come up with terms like well-being, quality of life. And you may, of course, come up with other things which are kind of relate to happiness, but are quite different concepts. So lack of anxiety, lack of distress might be qualities associated with happiness. You're not going to be very happy if you are very anxious and distressed. So mapping out those search terms is quite a complicated thing to do unless you're working in a field that's very, very closely defined, very technical, and where there's a long established kind of tradition of ways to approach it. So you may need a theory to help guide you in selecting those terms and knowing what you're going to mean by them. Okay. Well, so we've sorted all that out. We know what humanity is, we know what we want to do, and we know how we're going to investigate it. We also want to think about whether we're going to do any harm. Because our orientation to this is that we're going to do good. None of us have come here into doing social research in order to foster some kind of deliberately malicious ends, but it's very easy to do harm without intending it, and the research literature is littered with examples of that. Research governance is what institutions like this university and others do to try and keep an eye on how research is being undertaken, to try to make sure that it is properly conducted, Key aspects of that are research ethics and research integrity. In relation to the research ethics, you probably heard the term informed consent, and probably familiar with the idea that research subjects, either the people being researched, should have anonymity. Those have not been assumptions that have been made throughout the history of the development of social research. And there are many debates about how these things can be conducted. In the context of happiness, it's rather obvious that if you're going to start asking people about happiness, you may well draw them into consideration of unhappiness. If you're going to explore things like anxiety and distress and people's circumstances in their lives, it's very, very likely that you're going to go into territory that may be really quite uncomfortable for them, and of course for the researcher. So if you are part of a research program and you're employing a lot of researchers, you've got to look out for their well-being as well as your research subjects. So there's the ethics of the research process, also research integrity, and the P word, plagiarism, falsification. It's rather shocking and rather disappointing, but there are many examples where researchers have cut corners under pressure to publish, under pressure to produce results, and I'm afraid plagiarism and falsification of results, plagiarism being where you rip off somebody else's work and present it as your own, and falsification where you literally just stick in the numbers that suit you. In terms of research outcomes, there are also problems for researchers because somebody will have funded the research. You hope people will use it, but they may not use it in the ways that you intend. Use of research in the politics of blame is a big issue, for example, in educational research, where identifying things which appear to show weaknesses in one set of schools or whatever can result in consequences that certainly weren't intended by the researchers. In the context of research into happiness, because people tend to be very resilient and actually report much higher levels of happiness than you might expect, that can result in, there's no problem. Let's ignore the other difficulties that people run into because they're saying on this scale, 7.7 happiness, that's fine. Okay, so these outcomes can be ones that aren't intended but which the researchers really need to think about in the way they manage what they're doing. Okay, so let's go on to some of the nitty-gritty about the kind of data we might need to gather. Obviously, we're doing it to answer specific research questions, and that's something that has a whole field in itself on how you craft good research questions. But let's just point out for the sake of this lecture that you need to have some and you need to know what they mean. But you're then going to have to deal with how you're going to gather your data and how it's going to be analysed. The two terms that you'll have already encountered here are quantitative and qualitative approaches. So these are broad orientations to the way in which the research is going to be conducted, and they're also a hint to certain assumptions about epistemology, for example, about what you take to be the forms of knowledge that are achievable in your research. So let's, rather than just do qualitative, quantitative as the main headlines, let's just consider aspects of those two in relation to the questions about how we gather relevant data and then how we analyse it. Quantitative approaches turn things into numbers, and the main ways they're conducted are through, for example, surveys. They may be questionnaires. Those questionnaires may be conducted in a variety of ways. They may be interviews. You may do it online on the web. You may have somebody phone you up and go through a set of questions with you. Obviously, there's also experimental designs. An experiment is where you'd have a particular action or intervention taken, and you'd allocate people to receive that or to receive some kind of control. Could be nothing, could be a placebo as they're called. So you're making comparisons between a control group and an intervention group to see whether the intervention has had any kinds of effects. Were they good ones, were they bad ones, and what might they mean? Some of the key concepts, obviously if you're surveying there'll be a population, but in relation to happiness index, for example, for the UK, that population is millions and millions of people, and you may well not be feasible to reach all those people, too expensive, too impractical. So you're going to work with a sample of those people. In selecting your sample, you've got to think about how you're actually going to get the information about those people, how you're going to reach them. So you'll have a sampling frame, as it's called. So for an example of a sampling frame would be the electoral roll, which is a specific database. Now, the electoral roll will not actually have in it all the people who are eligible in principle, to vote. It has the people who are on the electoral roll. So there'll be omissions, but you'll have to make that kind of decision about how you're going to sample and what frame you will use to conduct the research. You're probably going to be considering randomization because, arguably the best way to avoid bias is not to select people, it is to randomly identify them using some computer-generated number or some other method that just applies a random step to selection of people. You might randomize people, then you won't get bias in your results. You won't accidentally draw unduly from a particular part of your population. Because if you're dealing with a very large sample from a very large population, randomization could easily result in unequal representation between men and women, for example. So there you might do what's called stratification. You would make a decision informed by a certain theory that gender differences are important, and you might decide to randomize within those two chunks. So you're stratifying those two chunks, and then you're randomizing within males and females.